today is Transfiguration Sunday, so there's the prayer touches on that, so let us pray. The living Word and a shining Son of God, in your presence we see the face of holiness. Overshadow us with your power and grace, so that we may keep your commandments and speak your truth with courage and love, all for the dazzling glory of your holy name. Amen. Okay, so a few quick announcements. I'm finally going to turn from the Old Testament next week. So when we get into Lent, the sermon series is going to be the Beatitudes. So I thought in here we'd cover the whole sermon on the Mount. So that's what we're going to do. But we're going to do one more Old Testament passage today. And I picked another hard one. That's kind of been the theme. In part, we're going to go back to Abraham, and I was kind of mean to him last week. Today I'm going to be kinder to him. So it's a big, all you'll see in your handout, besides the prayer, is a big long Bible passage. It's Genesis 18 and 19, and I put them in columns side by side, because part of what we're going to do is compare them, because they're a unit. So we tend to chop this up. These actually go together. I want to make one little quick comment. So one of the things I wish we could do in here more, but we can't do for a sake of time, is just read the Bible passage. So if we had like an hour and a half or so, right, we could go through and everybody read 2 verses, right, and go around the room, and we could do this exercise of paying attention to what we read. Like, do you notice things? Do you see patterns? Or, right? So I encourage you to do that in your own Bible reading. If you want to do it together with some other people, read these things out aloud, compare them, right? Because some of the things we could do is just to pay attention to patterns. So I'm going to do this a little bit, and then what we're going to do afterwards is just walk through this story. But so if we look at chapter 18, and let's say we were doing that exercise of paying attention, we would see the Lord appears to Abraham by the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. So we get a time. We get this phrase of God showing up to Abraham in the middle of the afternoon when it's hot, right? If we, yeah, right, that's actually what it is. Everyone ought to be taking a nap, right? And Abraham's, where is he sitting? He's sitting in the entrance to his tent. Why? It's hot. He's sitting in the shade, right? Now, if we think that this is from the book of Genesis, and the book is meant to be read as a whole, right? If we were sitting down to read the whole thing, we'd be about an hour into our time reading, maybe, right? So you could actually, from the start to here, maybe we haven't even got up yet, right? Well, how does God show up in the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve eat from the tree? He says he comes in the evening, in the cool of the day. So there's actually part of what's worth paying attention to is there are patterns, there are allusions, right? So
this as a mirage.
Well, but they show up and start talking to him, and he feeds them and he walks with them, right? But yeah, there is something interesting happening here, right? It's also worth pointing out is we get told by the narrator that it's the Lord, that it's God, but Abraham doesn't know this. To him, it's just three guys, right? Takes him a while to figure out who it is, right? But it isn't actually till about verse 9 when they start asking, hey, where's Sarah? And we're like, how do they know his wife's name is Sarah? He hasn't told them that, right? And he starts saying she's going to be pregnant when she's 89 years old, right? And they hear her laugh when she overhears. There's actually this really humorous scene here of God can hear what Sarah's thinking and asks Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? And Sarah says, I didn't laugh. And God says, yes, you did. Right? I mean, so that's when we start to figure out who's actually going on, right? There are some other kind of humorous things in here that we would pay attention to if we were reading it carefully. So if you go down that first column, chapter 18 to about verse 12, says Sarah overhears them talking. She laughs to herself and says, after I have grown old and my husband's old, shall I be truthful. In the original, the Hebrew text behind this, she's clearly saying it's Abraham's fault. He's the old one, not me. Right? But then notice what God says to Abraham. Why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? It's as if God is like, well, I don't want them to get in a fight over this, so I'm going to say that Sarah really was blaming herself. But that isn't what she says. God twists it a little bit. Right? So there's some humorous things, right? So I think this is just worth pointing out that we should go through and read some of these things. So that's part of what I'm going to do today, is just sort of pay attention to some of the details, right? The reason why I put the two stories in columns aside is, again, to compare, right? So these people come to Abraham, right? What does Abraham do? He gets up and runs to greet them. He shows them great hospitality. If we go over to the other column, that same kind of thing is going to happen, but not equally. So here, at least two of these three people, we'll talk about who they are in a bit, go to Sodom, where Lot is, right? He also gets up to greet them, bows his face down on the ground. So far, this is, actually it's the same, in Hebrew it's the same verbs, the same phrases. Like, it looks like somebody copied and pasted, right? It's supposed to be parallel, right? And he goes and he shows them hospitality too, but then the differences come in. So Abraham throws this ridiculous feast. Again, when this gets translated in English for us, they're trying to make it understandable. So if you go down to, where is it? Verse 5, it says, let me bring a little bread, right? And then he tells Sarah in verse 6, make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour. So in the Hebrew, we actually get a technical term there. It's a measurement. It's not just a choice measure. It's a ridiculous amount of bread. We could feed 50 people here, not 5. Right? And he goes and kills a fattened calf. Like, the calf is still out in the field. Right? I mean, how long is it going to take to kill the calf, slaughter it, butcher it, right? Get it ready to cook? We're talking like 8 hours here, right? I mean, this isn't a quick meal. He gives them right, exactly, right. I mean, this is taking a long time, right? So, but they're not eating till it's now evening, right? So he's hosting them and he's throwing this ridiculous feast, right? It's extravagant, right? So, I mean, I think you all just heard a sermon on Lazarus and the rich man, or you will hear it, right? In there too, Jesus tells us a story where he really exaggerates, right? I mean, we're told the rich man's wearing a suit made of purple. I mean, it would be as if we had someone who wore a suit made out of gold. I mean, it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. He throws this huge feast every day. It's extravagant. It's over the top. It's kind of what Abraham's doing here. He's throwing this huge feast. He's showing great hospitality. We go back to the other story, and what does Lot do? He has them come in, and he basically does give them the Fritos, right? He gives them unleavened bread, which is basically dough you throw on a pan and fry it up, right? There's a quick meal, right? Abraham waits on them. He doesn't sit down and eat with them. He's standing next to them. Lot says, come to my table. So Lot kind of shows them hospitality. And of course, who's Lot? He's Abraham's nephew. He's gone to live in Sodom. A big part of the story is he's a foreigner. He's basically an immigrant, right? He shows hospitality. Nobody else in the town does. And in fact, by the time we get to the end of their time, he wants the people of Sodom come and want to get those people out. So the big issue going on here is hospitality. Do you take care of those in need or not? Right? Abraham extravagantly takes care of these strangers who show up in the hot of the day, who need a drink, who need to be refreshed. He gives this to them. Lot kind of does the bare minimum, and the people of Sodom do the opposite. They're going to take advantage of these people, right? This is actually an important thing of understanding this story. So obviously, what's the big thing that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is oftentimes used for? Homosexuality. Like, this is where we get the term sodomy from, right? It comes from Sodom, right? So the way this story has been read historically is the sin of Sodom is homosexuality. It doesn't have anything to do with what's happening here. If there's a sin of Sodom, it's the failure to show hospitality. It's the failure to take care of the poor and the needy, or those who have need. And the Bible itself tells us this. If you turn my handout over, it's the only place I could fit it in. Ezekiel talks about this. So the Bible actually interprets itself here. And I've had to really truncate the passage, but if you can go read the whole thing in Ezekiel 16. Here the context is God is telling Israel, you guys have screwed up over and over and over again. You're going to get punished. You're going to go into exile, right? And what does he say? Your big sister is Samaria. Your little sister is Sodom with her daughters. This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it. So the sin of Sodom has nothing to do with homosexuality. It's failure to take care of the poor and needy. That's the problem here, right? So we have to understand how these two passages go together. You have to understand what the problem is, right?
What was the nature of their removal?
Fire and brimstone comes down and destroys the two cities, right? God wipes them off the face of the earth, basically, right? And what's happening in this Ezekiel passage is God saying, I'm going to do the same thing to you, because you're worse, Israel, right? But again, what's the problem? It's failure to take care of the poor and the needy, right? And again, this pairs really well with the parable of this was a lucky accident, but the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. It's the same thing going on there. What's the rich man's problem? Lazarus is put at his doorstep every day, right? And when they're down in the pit, like, he actually identifies him by a name. He knows who Lazarus is. This guy who's been begging us out of his gate every day, whom he doesn't ever help. And he expects Lazarus to still serve him, because he's high and mighty and Lazarus isn't. Same kind of things happening here, of the people of Sodom are failing to take care of others. We'll come back to that whole scene, right? But that's the problem. So what we have here is two stories that are paired. They're parallels. In the first one with Abraham, here Abraham's the hero. What does he do? He shows hospitality, which in Hebrew culture at this time, that's the highest form of justice and righteousness. If you help those who are in need, you're righteous, you're just. If you don't, if you take advantage of them, if you oppress them, that's the very definition of injustice, unrighteousness, right? So we have Abraham, who's the hero. He's righteous. We have Lot, who's got one foot in each camp, and we've got the people of Sodom, who are our example of injustice, right? So they're and they kind of go through them. They begin to sort of parallel each other, at least at the beginning, right? So let's kind of just tell the story of these two, right? Again, if we had time, we'd read the whole thing, but I think I'm going to just tell a story. So Abraham, he's sitting at the entrance of his tent. Lot, he's at the entrance of the city. What happens at the entrance of the city? That's where business happens. It's where you get together to make deals, to gossip, to see what's going on, right? So they're both in this place. These guys come, they go up to them, but notice how it's a bit different. Abraham gets up and runs to them. How old is he? He's 99 at this point, right? So this should be a little bit humorous to us, right? Old men don't get up and run, especially in this culture, it's not dignified, right? So a good parallel is one of Jesus' parables, the parable of the prodigal son, where the dad gets up and sprints to his kid because he sees him coming. He wants to get to him, right? He doesn't care what anybody else thinks. That's what Abraham does here. He's like, my job is to show hospitality. I'm going to run out to meet these guys, right? Of course, Abraham is very wealthy. He's a nomad, but he's probably got a troop of at least 80 to 100 people. The way the story is told, it's as if it's just him and Sarah here in a tent. He runs out to come meet these guys. He runs out to the field to get the calf. He tells her to go do all this cooking, right? It's this huge, elaborate ordeal, right? What does Lot do? He says, hey, come to my house, right? The interesting thing that happens in the Lot story is the angels, because that's who they are, we'll come back to that, say no at first. He says, hey, come to my house, have a meal, and spend the night. And they say, no, we're going to sleep here in the courtyard. Well, you all know this story. You've heard it a couple times before. What are these guys? What happens to these two messengers, these two angels? The people of Sodom want them to come out, right? We'll get to what that's all about. But if they hadn't been in Lot's house, they would have been exposed. So maybe Lot is trying to protect them. He's showing hospitality, right? But why do the guys refuse? Because they're actually sent to Sodom to destroy it. But they're still testing them to see just how bad they are. We read in chapter 18, God says, I've heard the outcry of the people who are being oppressed by Sodom. I'm going to destroy it. But in a sense, these two angels give them one last chance. Because remember, what happens in the story is Abraham starts bargaining with God. Are you really going to wipe out the whole town, Abraham says? God says, yes. Well, what if there's 50 righteous people? What if there's 40? What if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10? God says, yes, if there's 10 people, I won't destroy them, right? When we get to the part about Sodom, so it's in chapter 19, verse, what is it? Verse 4. But before they lay down to go to sleep, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, and actually it'd be better here to say people, because it isn't clear that it's just males, right? Both young and old, all the people to the last man. Right, we'd be reading this after we read about Abraham bargaining. Can we get down to 10 people? The idea is there's not even 10. They're all terrible. Right? Everybody, men, women, children, they're all there. Right? No one's righteous. Right? Even Lot isn't perfect because he dithers. He's like, he wants to go tell his sons-in-law, we need to leave. He says, I can't get out of the city in time before we destroy it. His wife, of course, famously turns around and gets turned into a pillar of salt. Right? The whole point of it is Lot and his family is being depicted as somewhere in the middle. Right? They want their cake and eat it too. They want to be righteous and with God. They also want all the benefits of being part of this city of Sodom. Right? So we're told God has heard this outcry of all this injustice. Lot seems oblivious to it, and he's in the city.
His wife was a pillar of the community?
Well, I mean, no, she's turned into, she's going to end up being that, right? But she's actually probably from Sodom. It's part of why he's there, right? The other interesting there is too, of course, is they turn on Lot. Why? Because he's a foreigner. They say, hey, you're here as our guest anyway. You're an alien. You're an immigrant. And now you're trying to tell us what to do. We're going to treat you worse than we were going to treat these guys. Right? So again, the parallel is Abraham shows this amazing hospitality. Sodom does the opposite. What do? They take advantage of people every time they can. This is why God's going to destroy them. Right? So let's go back to Abraham. So Abraham, these guys come. He hastens to help them. So again, the picture is this very, very old couple, right, hustling around trying to get this meal ready, producing enough food to feed 50 people, not 3, right? And then, you know, they're getting all this ready. These guys are eating. Sarah overhears what's happening, right? By the way, what do the guys ask? How does, right? Sarah's back there cooking, and they ask, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" Is there a parallel to that? Is that an allusion to anything? God comes down to Cain and says, "Where's your brother Abel?" Right? So there's all kinds of literary allusions happening. Right? It's giving us clues and giving Abraham in the story clues of who the identity of these 3 are. We're getting hints that this is God because these are the kinds of ways that God acts and talks, right? Abraham's going to begin figuring out who this person is, right? And they say, "Hey, the next time I come, you're going to have a baby." Sarah overhears this and laughs because she's 89. She's like, "How is this going to happen?" I've talked about that a bit already, right? So all of this happens, and then the guys get up to leave, right? And now we really begin to figure out who these 3 people are. So we're said, the Lord says, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm going to be doing?" Who's he talking to? Seems to be talking to herself, right? So this idea here of there's 3, but yet then there's 1 and there's 2, right? One of these people is clearly God. God has come in a human form, right? Which is a nice allusion to the New Testament, right? The other 2 are called messengers, which is just the word for angel, right? And then they're the ones who are going to go on to Sodom, because when we get to chapter 19, it's just 2, not 1. Where's the other one? He stays to talk with Abraham for a while. This is that whole argument of 50, 40, 30, 10, right? That's God and Abraham talking while the other 2 guys are on their way to Sodom. So in terms of a story, it works quite well of Abraham and God are talking while these other guys are on their way to Sodom, and then we can turn to that story right away. Katie.
Okay, this may be because I'm really cold and my brain's not
okay.
working very well, but I was just thinking the 3, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and it's not possible for
so I will pass this around. I brought this with me. It broke. It's supposed to be 2-paneled, but it's a very famous icon. This is actually what's an icon of the Orthodox Church of the Trinity, and it's a depiction of these 3. So historically, the Church has seen the Trinity here. It's probably not a very good reading of the passage, right?
And then 3, it's not possible for Sarah to have a son.
Right.
And it's not possible for Mary to have a son.
Right. There's clear connections. I mean, we're really quick on that, right? I mean, this happens a couple of times in the Old Testament. There are women who can't get pregnant. So there's, right, obviously, Sarah. There's, I'm going to blank on her name, Samuel's mother in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Hannah, there we go, right? And there's a couple other stories of it. It's all women who can't get pregnant. All the times they're very old, right? And God comes in and acts. So how does she get pregnant? We're told here, is anything impossible for God, right? The whole idea is God is acting, right? The theology behind this is this idea that when God is going to work to save human beings, it's His work. We don't do it, right? So how is Abraham's line going to be preserved and great nations are made out of him? It's not going to be through Hagar and Ishmael. It's going to be through Sarah and Isaac. Well, Sarah's 89. So only if God acts is this going to happen, right? We get to Mary, it's even more of a miracle of God acting, because at least in the case of Abraham and Sarah, right? I mean, just to be plainly obvious, she still gets pregnant from Abraham, but God has to act to make it happen. With Mary, it's all God's action. The human agency is removed totally. So how does God save? It's totally grace. We don't even have a man involved, right? We need a woman, though. Just point that out, right? Anyway, so this is what's happening. So then, right, these guys go on. They go to Sodom, right? And then we get the same kind of repeating of this story. Lot begins to show them hospitality, right? They say no. They're testing Lot in Hasis because maybe he's a little bit clued in as to what's going on in Sodom. He knows how terrible the people there are, right? He ought to have left. He ought to have gotten out of there, but he's staying. He's clearly doing business there. He's making a living. Again, this is the point of him. He's this problematic figure because he wants one foot in each camp. He wants to be with God. He also wants to make money. Yep.
Okay, and it appears to me that he's living in a solid house because he has a door.
Yep.
He's not living in a tent.
Not living in a tent. So it's probably a walled city. Right, Sodom and Gomorrah would have been walled cities. So these are well-established cities. They're engaging in commerce, right? And this is part of their problem of their oppressing people, right? I mean, we're told God has heard this outcry. I'm going to destroy this town, right? So it isn't only that they treat people who come and visit them poorly. They're actively engaging in acts of injustice, right? And God's going to call them out on it, right? They've been given opportunity to repent and show that they have again, showing hospitality to a stranger in this culture is the bare minimum of being a decent human being, right? Someone needs a drink of water and a meal, you give it to them. They fail to do even that, right? There was a hand somewhere.
Somehow, I thought, heard or something that Lot was nephew.
He is.
Where the heck did I get that?
Yes, he is. So that's earlier.
Okay.
And that's the whole, again, this is the whole, what's happening is, so Abraham is going to be depicted as the hero whom God chooses, even though, as we talked about last week if you were here, he's not perfect either, right? Lot is a nephew who he brings with him. And as their sort of prosperity increases, Lot's kind of constantly trying to get the upper hand. If we go back to chapter 13, he's got his sheep in the better fields. And eventually Abraham and him have to split ways because they're too big to basically keep traveling together. So they divide their land and their flocks. But what's happened here is Lot has ended up in Sodom, right? So he's being portrayed as one, he's part of Abraham's family. He knows God. He's kind of a righteous. But again, he also wants to be part of the world. He wants both, right? And part of what this story does as a whole is to show that's not going to work, right? It's pick this day whom you're going to choose, God or the world. And Lot's trying to do both. People of Sodom are totally with the world, right? So there's kind of three things here, and we're being told be like Abraham, right? What's going to happen with Lot, right? As these angels are going to come, they're in his house, he's taking care of them. The people of Sodom come and say, hey, send those guys out, we want to know them. That's what the Hebrew says. It says know, right? So historically, the way that this passage has been interpreted is that know here is an idiom for have sex with them, right? Which is a common Hebrew idiom. There are other passages in the Hebrew Bible where we have to say clearly, know here means I'm going to know you like a husband knows his wife, right? Right. I mean, so that's ways of saying. When Mary says, "I've never known a man," it's a common idiom, right? But it doesn't have to be the case. It can also be, we want to talk to them, right? So again, if this is a walled city, If they've been doing things that has involved oppressing others, there's probably people who don't like them. So it could also be that they think these two guys are spies, and they want to talk to them. We want to figure out who they are, right? And the fact that who of these two guys gone to hang out with is Lot, a foreigner, who they've allowed to stay, right? I mean, it's playing on all your stereotypes of, well, the immigrant over here's got these visitors that we're a little suspicious of. Let's go figure out what's going on. So it doesn't actually have to be about sex, right? The reason why most people think it is, right, is how does Lot respond? He says, no, don't do that to these guys. Here are my two daughters who have never known a man, right? Which we also go, this is awful, right? Well, recall Abraham did this twice. Right? He did it with his wife Sarah twice, right? Basically says to two kings, yeah, she's my sister, right? He's trying to protect his own skin, right? A lot is perhaps doing that. He's also trying to show hospitality in a very distorted way. Yes, I'm supposed to show hospitality to these two guys, protect them. How am I going to do that? Well, take my daughters instead, right? Now, again, it doesn't have to be for sex. He could basically be giving them as hostages to say, hey, here, take my two daughters so you know we're not spies in here planning your overthrow. Because if that happens, you've got my daughters, right? I think the one other reason why there probably is a sexual aspect here is there's this, if that's what's happening, there's sort of this specter of the rape that haunts the whole story. A rape does finally happen at the end. Who's raped? Lot is by his daughters. It's a weird story. Right? But I mean, that's what actually happens. That's how the story actually ends. They flee, they get out. Only people that get out of the city are Lot and his two daughters. His wife is turned into a pillar of salt. It says he has sons and son-in-laws. The son-in-laws and perhaps two other daughters seem to not believe, so they're destroyed. That's probably why their mom turns around. My other kids are there. What's happening? Right? And we don't know what happens to his sons. We're just not told. Right? But they're the only two that escape. They're told to go live in a village. A lot seems to be anxious that the people in that village are going to turn out like the people of Sodom. So they go and move into a cave. And the girls are like, what are we going to do? How are we going to continue our family line? What hope are we going to have? They say our only option here is dad. So they get him drunk and have sex with them and have kids, right? Their kids, by the way, this is what these stories oftentimes do, end up being the fathers of the nations of Moab and the Ammonites, who are Israel's historical enemies, right? Those names, by the way, Moab and Ammonites, are basically words that mean children born of incest. Right? So a story is also being told here of where did these people come from. There are neighbors, there are enemies, there also are distant relatives. And Abraham's the father of many nations. Right? Even though there's this weird way of it happening, right? And yeah, so there's all kinds. Yeah, right. So it all comes back around, right? So I mean, these are some of the parallels that are happening here, right? And again, what's the main issue? It's how are you going to be in the world? Are you a person who's just or not? But justice is being defined as showing hospitality to those who are poor and needy, right? Has nothing to do with sex. Apart from the fact that if that's what's happening here, right, they're doing a great injustice, right? They're abusing people, oppressing people, right? And again, I think it's very important to say it isn't just the men that come out to send these guys out here. It's the whole town, right? That's what they're trying to do. If they're trying to rape them, that's actually somewhat common at the time as a strategy in a war. This still occurs, right? Of how do you humiliate and just sort of destroy the well-being of your enemy. You sexually humiliate them, right? This is part of it's a warfare more than it's sex, right? So I mean, one of the key things here is this really doesn't have anything to do with homosexuality, right? Other than that, that's really a way for men to humiliate other men. It's like in a prison, right? The people who are doing this aren't actually gay. It's about power, right? So again, if we point all this out, like what's going on in all of this story, I mean, there's some principles we can pull out. One, we've got a story in which God appears in a human form. That's a big thing for us as Christians to see this also in the Old Testament of God actually comes and appears as a human being, right? Tells us that this is something that God does, right? And tied in with just the Genesis story, we're being told that we human beings are created in God's image, right? So there's a connection here. So that's one important thing of, right? We're being told this is how God shows up, right? The other big thing is obviously, hospitality, right? It's what is the basic thing required of you to be a righteous person, right? Is to help the poor and the needy, right? So Abraham here is being depicted as the hero. Here he gets it right. Right? He fails at other times, but here he gets it right. He shows great hospitality to these people, right? And the fact that he's doing it to God is to his benefit, but he doesn't know that it's God, right? When Jesus talks about, whoever you give a cold drink of water to or share a meal with, you do this unto me, right? Every time you help someone who's thirsty, right? This is where he's getting it from, right? So part of this is just to say, here's what you do. A righteous person helps those who are poor and oppressed. An unjust person oppresses them. That's what a sodomy is. Nothing to do with sex. It has to do with oppression, right? And then there's the fact that we actually get three categories here, right? And I think that's the moral of this story, right? Of Abraham is the model of righteousness, extravagance, hospitality. Lot is in the middle. He's lukewarm, to use that term, right? He wants both things. He wants to help them, but not too much, right? And then there's the people of Sodom who are going to be destroyed, right? And why? Because they're awful. Like they're the example of being unrighteous because they oppress the poor and the needy, right? And even with, so if you're hearing this as an ancient Israelite, part of what you're hearing is, well, obviously don't be like Sodom. That would be the people of Babylon and Assyria. But don't be this lukewarm person either. Because what happens to Lot? He isn't mentioned again after this story. He just disappears, right? We're not told his family lineage other than that the ancestors of these two children he has with his daughters are the people of Moab and the Ammonites, and they're Israel's enemies. So we're kind of being told, here's what happens if you're lukewarm. Yeah, fire and brimstone might not come down, but it's not going to turn out go well. Go be like Abraham. And again, remember, he screws up too often. But okay, that's it wasn't intended to be, but I guess it can be, right? So that's just a really quick overview. Questions? We actually have time for questions.
Really question
Yep.
back when Abraham, introduces Sarah as his sister.
Yep.
I'm sorry, but I think of Sarah just like these two daughters
Yep.
of one. I think there was collusion between her and Abraham. And
maybe there is.
because I wouldn't, because of what she sees her son, her legitimate son, with the
Yep.
concubine son. So I think that there's something more going, almost like Eve in the garden. That's what I kind of got.
Yeah, but what's worth pointing out, so Abraham does it twice. The first time he does it is before there's it's before Hagar and Ishmael, it's before Isaac, right?
I'm still not convinced that she doesn't have some clue.
Well, and maybe she does, but it's still the case that but then it's just as bad. They're basically saying yeah, we're married, but they might kill Abraham if we don't do this. So where am I going to go? So they basically just kind of agree well, I guess our marriage is over. You're going to marry the king now. We just won't tell him. And then of course God intervenes. I mean, that's the big thing here is who's really the main character who's doing all the action and intervening? It's God. Right? The human beings screw it up constantly. Right? And with the daughters too, in the we don't even know how old they are. We're just told they haven't known a man. Are they 17? Are they 12? We don't know, right? It's whatever's happening. It's even if they're in on it, it's awful. He's basically saying, "Go be whores," and they're like, "Okay," or he's forcing them into it, right? It's just terrible all along, right? And of course, God doesn't allow it to happen. God intervenes. And the angels blind them, and they can escape.
Excuse me. So maybe God should have intervened.
Right.
Also speaks to the culture in that they don't think very much of women.
Well, I think this is definitely a theme, right? It's that women are being, but women are being under. But I think it's worth pointing out that God steps in constantly and saves them, but also says, well, I'm going to work through the women. I mean, they're the ones who keep it all together often, right?
Always.
There was somebody else, right?
Is there a quick conversation about how we screwed up the concept of Sodom and Gomorrah being related to sexuality? Well, because I think it's an easy surface reading of the text, right? Kind of says it focuses on homosexuality, especially, which this is just the case for most of the history that this text is being read. It's been read in cultures that think homosexuality is abominable anyway. So they already think it's terrible, right? Which our culture did till within my lifetime. I'm 44, right? I mean, it's right. And so it's easy once you already have that sort of bias, then you go then and read this story and go, oh, that's what it is. But if you read it carefully, it isn't about that, and the Bible itself tells us it isn't about that. Right? I mean, it isn't anywhere saying here homosexuality is bad. It's saying rape is bad. Right? But that's the issue, right? And that's part of what's ended up happening, right? And so, if you want to sort of argue against homosexuality, this text kind of comes to you in a gift wrap, right? But if you really open it carefully, it isn't about that at all, right?
Incest is also an abomination.
Right.
I mean,
but it keeps happening. Right? And I mean, Jesus' own lineage, I mean, this is in there. I mean, he's not coming from a lot, but there's a Judah and Tamar, which is going to happen a couple chapters after this, right? Where she goes and sleeps with her father-in-law because he won't find her a new husband, right? And that's an element in here too. I mean, the two girls here, what do we say about them? I mean, at the end of the
a story, they're being depicted as people who actually have hope, but their options are very limited. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and they do the only thing they see as possible. Right? Which, again, to go back to some of the women in these stories, that happens frequently. They do the best that they can under terrible circumstances. So you've got these two girls. You've got Tamar. We can even think of Garuth, or who's the woman who helps the spies in Canaan? I'm blanking on her name. Rahab, right? I mean, there's all these women who what they're doing is not what we would call wholesome, but it's the best thing they can do under the circumstances, right? Which is why they aren't punished. They're actually, in a certain sense, they're showing a faith, but in very terrible circumstances. Lot's the one who gives up. He goes and lives in a cave. It's like there's no hope. Everything's terrible. Right?
That's why the daughters think they need to...
Yeah, I mean, he's probably keeping them there in the cave, and they're like, what are we going to do here? Right? How are we going to continue our... I mean, there's a big element here of our family needs to continue, or we're done. Well, how are we going to do it? The only command available to us is our Father. Right? Right. Well, and that's what it kind of comes in, and they're a bit redeemed, right? So I mean, part of the overall point isn't just these sort of morals we can pull out, but it also shows how do we read these stories, right? The other element is, I think, that helps get this passage distorted is we fail to see that chapter 18 and 19 are a unit. Like if you pull out just part of chapter 19 about Lot and these guys in Sodom, you end up focusing on that rather than seeing, no, a story is being told here. We have to read the Abraham part to understand what hospitality looks like, to then go see Lot and the people of Sodom fail to be hospitable. Like, it has to be read together. In fact, the whole book should be read together, right? And again, I mean, this is hard, but we tend to chop the Bible up and take a little tiny passage at a time and read them in isolation, right? Well, it's okay to do that devotionally, but we ought to turn as often as we can and see, how does this fit into the whole? So how does this passage fit into Genesis as a whole? How does it fit into the first 5 books of the Bible, which are a unit as a whole? How does it fit into the Old Testament as a whole? How does it fit in the whole Bible as a whole? Like, keep asking those questions. And to pay attention to the allusions. Scripture alludes to itself constantly. Right? I mean, we're supposed to make these connections of God came to talk to Adam and Eve in the garden. Oh, God's showing up again to talk to Abraham. Right? He comes in the heat of the day, but he comes in the cool of the day, and what's happening there, right? A question of where's Sarah, right? We're being given hints that this is God talking, and something important's about to happen, right? They're literary cues, right? I also think we should pay attention to the things that there's just humor here. I mean, I love the idea of Sarah blames Abraham, and God's kind of like, well, I'm not gonna make Abraham mad at you, right? It's just a good husband wife a joke, right? I mean, anyway, other questions? Well, then we'll come back next week.